YouTube land? This is Brenton Sawin coming to you from Lexington, Kentucky, the Bluegrass State. Well, we finally got Q coming back on. His first two interviews went really well. They've done well, and I've had quite a few people email me privately asking to have him back on the show, and we've always planned on him coming back anyway. And Q and I talk kind of regular on the side, and I had taken some notes and I cannot find them, so we kind of talked for a little bit before the show here, and we decided that Q was going to tell us, coming from Northwest Mississippi, where he lives, some stories from the area that he lives in. He was going to tell us some other stories that aren't his, and then we'll get back to his stories that are quite interesting, and I think you all will like this very much. So anyway, how you doing today, Q?
Hey man, I'm awesome. How are you doing?
Doing great, man. A little bit cold up here, and it's warm down there, you said, and I wished I was down there because I don't like cold weather.
It's not the tropical weather I would like, I would like to be sunning on the beach in Florida, but man, I'm out in the sticks instead.
Right, yeah. Well, we talked about quite a few interesting things, and you certainly have a lot of very interesting activity in your area that not all people are aware of for sure, but some are, and you seem to have found quite a few of them. Isn't Coonbo and Bear from down in that area?
Believe it or not, those are like some of the few guys that I actually tend to listen to, man. I would love to meet those guys, but like my understanding is Coonbo is actually from the Northeast area.
Right.
And so I believe he's like the regions that he's actually described are actually somewhere probably about maybe like an hour and a half, 2 hours away or something like that. So he's really not too far out of the way, but he's actually I do believe on the northeast side of Mississippi.
Right. But he is in Mississippi, and it seems to be a really interesting place for the Bigfoot topic. And yeah, I like them guys too, and I've actually reached out to them and got a call back from I think his name is Mark or something like that. One of the guys from the show there, I can't remember what his name is right now, but so he said he was going to pass the information to Bear, and boy, that would be pretty cool because those guys are pretty fun to listen to. One of the shows I listen to is that one, and then Vic Condiff's stuff, and Vic does have a Bigfoot show now, other than the Dogman show that is really good also, and he does a super job. And if anyone out there has a Bigfoot story or a Dogman story or any interesting mysterious story, you can email me at brentonsawin@gmail.com, and we'll set up a pre-interview and talk to you. And I appreciate everyone that comes on the show, and they always end up being my friend afterwards. And one of these days, I was talking to Q, I'll travel around maybe this year and come see all of you all and that have been a guest on the show. Q and I guarantee you would have some fun. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, man! I'll take you out to the Mexican place we have here. It's like some of the best Mexican food that outside of Texas. So
yeah, that's whenever I go on vacation, I get back sometimes, and people ask me, "Well, what'd you do? Where'd you go?" I always tell them about the places I ate, and they're like, "Well, what did you do?" We went down there to Florida to eat, and went swimming too, but we ate. That's the highlight.
Well, being single, generally, like when I go on vacation, I can't talk about the adult things that I do when I go on vacation. There's children listening, and I just can't do that,
Right. And I know that you wanted to say thank you to the fans for all the likes and things that your video got last time. If you want to, you could do that right now if you want, and then get into your stories.
As a matter of fact, like for everybody listening, I'd like to say thank you. God bless you. This subject is something that's not very easy for me to talk about. I know there's a lot of people out there they're very comfortable with coming out and talking about the subject, but for me, it's actually very hard to talk about And I didn't expect the response that my video had actually gotten. So I'd like to say a very big thank you. I would like to, like, you know, give you ladies a big hug, and like for you fellas, I would actually shake your hand. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
no
There were
hug for
some.
the guys.
There were several people who commented that they could tell how traumatized you were by your encounters. And his videos are the Tribe of Sasquatch Part 1 and Part 2, where he was hunting and got surrounded. And then another encounter he talked about is where one came out in the road and actually blocked the road. And several people said that they could hear your voice shaking and they could tell how traumatized you were by those encounters, and you certainly could hear how serious of a nature the encounters were for you, and so I just wanted to let you know, even though the comments were disabled for the video, that you had quite a few people that really appreciated you coming on, and we're very thankful to you for it.
Thank you very much for that. You know, like those stories, other than just talking to my family about it, that's only about the second time I've ever told that story publicly. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that probably are wondering, why do I do this, And like that stuff, it still bothers me to this day. I mean, like I won't go out in the woods alone, nothing like that. And, one of the biggest reasons that I come out and I talk about these things is because people are under the impression that these creatures are always these nice, fluffy things that want to give you a hug. But at the end of the day, there might be some out there that are what that will not hurt you, and they're going to run away from you. But I think people should also know there's a darker side to these creatures. And, like my first encounter happened to me, I was somebody that basically had just heard about the subject on TV. It wasn't something I'd ever focused on in my daily life. But I never want for that to happen to somebody. I never want any man or woman or child to ever experience that. I don't ever, people shouldn't stop enjoying the woods because these things are possibly out there. People go out in the woods all the time, and they never see these things, and they can go their entire life without seeing one. But I never want anybody to go out into the woods and have something like that happen to them. And then, so like for me, it's about bringing awareness that there's this dark side to these creatures, and I think people should know about it just as much as we should know about the good side of these creatures.
Right. Yeah. So if you want to, man, could you tell us about the elderly lady and then the hunter incident? And these are stories from your area that you have collected talking to people in your area.
Well, some of the stories that I've collected, I don't really think people would just find, just overly amusing, just simply because they're very simple stories where people would just kind of have run-ins with these things. But like I've got like encounter stories going back to about the late 50s with these creatures. And last year, for example, there was an older lady who lived in an area about 30 minutes away. And what it is, she lived by herself out in a mobile home. So what it is her family would go out and check on her and stuff like that. And she would tell them about these big monkeys that would come out to her house at night. And she said that these creatures would bang on her house, that they would run across the roof. And so they thought maybe that she was losing her mind and she was getting Alzheimer's and like dementia and that sort of thing. But what it turned out is like she was actually experiencing these creatures, and her family just absolutely would not believe her. Okay, so like the next story, I can't reveal the source of who actually told me this, but I got a phone call one day, and this is actually from Kumbo's area. There was basically 4 hunters that had gone out into the woods, and I guess they were I don't know if they were deer hunting or what kind of hunting they were actually doing, but these guys basically went out and they all kind of had their certain spots. What ended up happening is one of the guys ended up walking up on a Sasquatch, and being that he'd never seen anything like that, I don't agree with like shooting one just because you've never seen it, and I don't think their intention was to do that. He was so overcome with fear that, of course, the thing he ends up doing is he ends up shooting the creature. Okay, so then, like, after he goes and he shoots the creature, he goes and he finds the other 3 guys that are with him. And so they go and they're looking at this thing and they're examining the body. And it freaks them out just how humanoid looking that this creature actually is. And so they decide that what they're going to do is they're actually going to bury it. So upon burying it, they decide that they need to go to the authorities about this because of how human looking it is. Okay, so like basically what it is one guy stays behind with the body, and then the 3 guys end up going to the authorities. They end up coming back, I believe, with a sheriff and a detective. So they come back to find this man, and his body had basically been ripped apart. His head had been pulled off, all 4 limbs had been taken off, and his body had been banged across a tree. All right, so they found the guy dead on the ground, and the Bigfoot body they had actually buried. The creatures had actually came back. They actually dug up the body, and so the body was completely gone. They found this guy completely dead. And one of the guys that was involved in that absolutely will not go into the woods anymore. So there's
Wow.
the real horror story for people who don't think that these things will hurt you. And, you know, that's like you kind of have to put under the category of being provoked, you know, but it just goes to show you that if you go out there and you walk across one of these things and you're scared and you shoot it, it just goes to show you what can actually happen to you.
Right. So yeah, because that was a family member to the Bigfoot, wasn't it?
It was, and you know, like a lot of times, I found like the type A's that we have in the region. A lot of times, it'll be like a male, a female, and generally you have like a juvenile. And then like sometimes they have these family units where like they tend to have like their own little areas. You'll have some that might stay in a certain parameter, and then you might have some that are part of that family, and they'll go and they'll stay like a few miles out of the way. But would you like basically when they get riled up, they will come together like a family unit, and they will go out and defend themselves. They really will.
Right.
And another interesting story that happened was probably like a place that was about say about 40 minutes away. There was a gentleman that was on the way to daycare to actually go and pick up one of his children. And basically, what ended up happening, you know, was he basically. I don't know, like, basically how, like, the event would have taken place. He was driving a Jeep, and he basically, what it was, is he had skidded off the road. You could see where, like, the skid marks from where he had actually skidded off the road. And so, like, basically when they went and they found his Jeep, the door was open. All right, so then the guy, he came up missing, and after about 2 weeks of looking for him, they went and found his body, and it had actually been tucked under a creek bank. And then they found that basically there wasn't a scratch on him. He had his wallet with all his money and credit cards. He had all his jewelry. So everything like that was intact, but what they ended up finding were these tracks that basically had circled the body.
Wow. So do you think he was
Yeah.
hiding from it and then died of exposure or something?
Well, they said the autopsy report basically concluded that he'd had a heart attack.
Wow.
You know, I was actually listening to Big Show a few nights ago, and there was a gentleman talking on there about how Dogman will actually run out into the road. And they'll do this in hopes of just basically coaxing you out of your vehicle, so you'll come out and they'll actually get you. And I'm just really wondering if there's some of these creatures that kind of do the same exact thing, because that kind of gives you the impression of what may be happened here. And you know, like with my second encounter, for example, to this day, I don't really understand what the intention of that creature was. But sometimes I kind of wondered that myself. You know, I wonder like, okay, this thing sit here and stood in the road. What was his intention? I just kind of wonder if maybe it was doing something like that to me as well. And you know, like you kind of have to be open to all areas of what these creatures' behavior are like when they're like this.
Right. Yeah, because in your second encounter there, you said that it seemed like it was looking over your car, like it was looking at something else, right?
It did, and I was under the impression. I mean, you would have just really gotten the impression that it was maybe looking at something behind you. And I'm so distracted looking at what's in front of me, you're not thinking, okay, maybe I should look over my shoulder here, you know. And I just really, to this day, I kind of conclude that there was like an underlying agenda there that I just couldn't quite figure out. And you know, with that particular creature, you know, we're talking about other people's encounters. You know, like I had some friends in that particular area, and I've also met a lot of people from that region. And the height of our activity seems to start taking place around the 90s, the mid 90s to like the early 2000s. And so a lot of people were having these encounters with these creatures. And they were roadside encounters where people were basically having these vehicles launch an attack at their vehicles. Okay, there was a lady that was actually going down a gravel road that was like on the complete opposite side of the lake. And so it was about dusk, and she told me that they were just minding their own business, listening to the radio, they were driving about 35, 40 miles an hour down the road. And they said they looked on the other side of this barbed wire fence, and there was this creature running alongside the road. Now, she told me it was dark enough that that the creature's eyes were actually reflecting red. And she said this thing ran really fast. She said they were probably going about 35 and 40 miles an hour. And she told me that the creature was basically almost able to keep up with them at that amount of speed. And, of course, they freaked out and gunned it, and so they got away from that particular thing. All right, so then going back to, like, I believe this would have been about, like, the early or mid-90s. Same thing around that lake region. There's a lot of these little back roads that you can take off the main roads to some of these lakes. So people, they'll either go out there and they'll go mud riding, or they'll go out there and do adult things, you know, for the children listening. I don't want to say what, but you can use your imagination, you people out there who have a dirty mind. But basically, these guys were going out there and mud riding. And they said after they'd been mud riding and stuff, they had actually sat there and they were parking. So they said they basically noticed that something was coming up behind the vehicle. And, of course, they didn't see anything but the body, but they said there was this brown creature that was basically coming up to the back of where the tailgate was. And, of course, they freaked out and they gunned it and they got away from that place.
Wow.
And, you know, my grandmother and stuff, you know, like my grandmother had actually never had, like, a physical encounter with these creatures. But, you know, like, going back, you know, I mentioned them in, like, the first episode that we did. Now, my grandmother, when I was a very small kid, you know, like, my grandfather, when I used to go traveling with him into, like, the woods a lot of time, I used to think that he was the most paranoid individual on planet Earth, because he would always tell me things like, well, you stay in the truck, don't get out of my sight, you stay where I can see you. So, you know, being a silly little kid, you don't realize there's things out there that can hurt you. So, of course, when he wouldn't be looking sometimes, I would get out of the truck and I would start walking into the woods. And he would start freaking out and being like, I told you, stay in the truck and blah, 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 blah. So I never understood why he would be freaking out so bad. So I was telling my grandmother one day, you know, she had like a vegetable garden. So like when I was a kid, I would go out and I would go and help her. And she would start talking about these catamounts. And she told me, like, when she was growing up, she said they would have this bean field. And so she said, like, you know, around like the late afternoon time, they would go out to the bean field and they would hear this thing screaming at them from like the wood line. And she told me, some of the things she told me about these catamount creatures are things that I kind of left off in the first episode. But she told me that these creatures that they used to see back then would actually dig a hole and they would actually scream into it like a panther will do. And she told me, like, something that, like, I've actually heard in a lot of Native Indian stories. She said you would hear, like, children crying and you would hear women crying. And then when people would go into the woods, they would never be seen again.
Wow. Why would they dig a hole and scream into it? To make it muffled or something?
To give you the impression they're farther away than they really are.
Wow, that is incredible. I've never heard that.
We actually do have panthers here. A lot of people say that we don't, but like here in the South, like they are very commonly seen. People just don't run to the internet and report it all the time. It's just the panthers are not seen as a big deal. But like if you were to actually see one, you know, a lot of people refer to it as being like a Mexican jaguar. I've actually seen two in my life, and they don't look like the panther bagheera. You know, like the species of panther that you have in like other countries. They're actually they look more like a jaguar or more like the puma type. They have more of the boxier features. Like if you could actually go and look at one at the zoo, and sometimes they're black, but sometimes they have kind of a steel brown and almost kind of like a reddish kind of a tone to them. And like the land that we actually have in the country, I've actually gone and seen one out there before, and we just don't mess with them. And then, you know, like there was a few years ago where people kept saying, oh, we don't have them, we don't have them. And there was the guy that lived out in the country that actually got a picture of one in his backyard, and they actually published it in the local newspaper. So, yes, we do have panthers here.
Wow. So sometimes your grandfather and them knew these squatches, or you all knew them, to make sounds of like babies and things like that to lure people into the woods?
Yes, they talked about that. They said that, like, there were cases, you know, my grandfather, he grew up in Alabama, and my grandmother did live there for a little while, but she grew up in another place in somewhere in Mississippi. I can't remember the exact name of the area. But, yeah, they said commonly that you would have people come up missing. And sometimes they would attribute disappearances to these creatures because you would have people that go into the woods and just would never be seen again. You know, it's almost something like David Paulides would write about.
Right. Wow, That's interesting for sure. Yeah,
And
it seems like in the Mississippi area, there's certain groups of them that are a little more aggressive than some that you may hear about in other parts of the country. Sometimes you hear these stories where they're different, but so I'm not going to say I know every case, but for the most part, I would be extremely cautious about any of them, especially down there in that area, because even Kumbo and Bear and those guys talk about these creatures being quite aggressive and dangerous, and so
well, I think possibly the reason for that is they don't have as much exposure to human beings. I used to find it so shocking because really the areas of a lot of these creatures are not what you would call like the deep rural areas. They're not like in the deep set country like people think. And then like something I discovered over time is like a lot of the people going back to like the 50s, like into the late 90s, a lot of the people who owned the lands around here were the original property owners. So like it would be like the first guy who had it. And something I found out that was quite common, you have like somebody who might have the 300 acres. And so they might use like maybe about 50 or 60 of those acres to do farming and stuff like that. But there's a very large portion of their property that they would never even look at or even, so much explore or go and look into. And so you end up finding out in the long run that what it is people, they don't ever know what's on their property because some of these people that have like a lot of acreage, they never venture out there to see what's out there. And that's really how some of these creatures are out there, because they have lands in which humans don't go into that basically border where humans are humans are working and interacting and doing that sort of thing. And so we don't know they're out there, but they actually are.
right. So your grandparents called them catamounts.
Yeah, and like growing up, we never knew what they were talking about. We really didn't. Like they never went into like description of what they look like. And like I think my great grandfather, maybe he'd maybe seen something in his life that he just never told us about. Because I mentioned before, he was a very tough guy. He was one of these people. He never talked about paranormal stuff. He had no interest in like ghosts. You'd never heard him talk about like fairies and UFOs or anything like that. But anytime they would talk about that subject, he would just get this look in his face. Like I described, as like you would see a ghost or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Did you all ever know them to be called boogers?
No, we actually had never heard that before, and like honestly, until like YouTube and stuff like that, I'd never heard them referred to as anything like that. I mean, like most of my life, I just basically heard them, referred to as Bigfoot and Sasquatch. And for the record, I actually hate the word Bigfoot because I think it just really makes the whole subject into a bit of a joke. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
people actually act like these creatures didn't fall off the earth until Roger Patterson got his footage in like the late 60s or whatever. But in talking about people's encounters, there was an older gentleman I met probably back in the early 2000s. He told me back in the late 50s they were back in some of the lands back here. They were basically clearing out trees and stuff like that to make some of the highways and some of the roads. So he told me they've been working on a bulldozer and they've been like clearing trees. So he said it was him and his brother. So he said they had actually been taking like a break from what they were doing. And so they kind of had the feeling they were being watched. So they said they were sitting at the very base of where a tall hill would have been. And so they said when they started looking up to the top of the hill, they saw this, what they described as being kind of like a brown, I guess kind of an auburn colored creature was just sitting there and just watching them. And, basically one brother got the attention of the other and they were like, man, look at that. And so he said that they ended up actually following the creature and chasing behind it. And then like, something people should know about is like, you should never go after these creatures, man, because sometimes all they're trying to do is lure you into a spot. These creatures sometimes pretend to be innocent, but sometimes they're very deceptive, which is something that, apes have a thing of doing, like chimpanzees and certain creatures like that. People think they're these cute, cuddly little things for the circus, but in nature, chimpanzees are actually very violent creatures in some cases.
Right. Yeah. Could you maybe talk about some of your mom's encounters, like at the barn and things like that?
Sure. Well, you kind of pick up from where we started off last time. Let's just say, like, between the years of 2004 to about 2006 when she moved out there. From the time that my mom moved out there, I mean, she basically got hounded by this particular female Sasquatch the entire time she lived there. So even when that female wasn't being necessarily aggressive, she would always go and prowl around the house at night. And some of the things that would end up happening to my mom, for example, something I should mention is a lot of the creatures here are actually very seasonal. They tend to come out, it seems, about mid-October. And then when you start getting into the months of about June and July, when it gets very hot and humid here, you absolutely will not see them out at all. And so a lot of times, like, sort of like you could say what the safe zone would actually be for that particular property. If you were to go out there before 3 p.m., it would just be like a picture perfect day. Like you didn't have to worry about anything. You didn't have to worry about looking over your shoulder. But when you would go out there sometimes after about 3:30 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon during like the fall, you could just sense that these things are around. I mean, it's just like this heavy energy. So like when Mom was having her encounters, she didn't always tell me like upon the day that it would happen. Sometimes she would absolutely just kind of wait a few days, and then what it was is she wasn't trying to freak us out, me and my sister. And then like sometimes when I'd have encounters down there, what it was is I wouldn't tell her either.
So your mom had this female squatch that was around the house, and it was kind of basically giving her problems.
Yeah, see, we already knew that we had some creatures out there, and going kind of back to like what the other story is. When all this stuff first started happening, we weren't sure how many of them there were out there. I'd seen the female before, and then I also knew there was a male out there. So like like from my first encounter, I learned that sometimes there's always more than one of these creatures, and basically what it was, some of the first encounters my mom would have, I mean, like we say, we knew these creatures were out there and stuff, is the female would come up around the house at night. And then what she would do is she would be peering in the windows and just, peeping in the windows and stuff. So she would actually end up walking along the side of the trailer. So when she would walk along the side of the trailer, she'd be walking with her weight against the side of the trailer. So you would hear just, making a motion down the side of the trailer and stuff like that. And that kind of stuff like went on with her for like quite a few months. She had these 2 Jack Russell dogs, and then whenever the female would actually get close to the bedroom, it would actually set the dogs off, and they would start barking, and then she would kind of just vanish into the background, so to speak. And Mom actually had quite a few like physical encounters, like where she would be outside feeding like the horses and stuff like that. And when she was working and stuff, like her schedules would be very different. So what had happened is like if she couldn't feed the horses and stuff during the day, I would actually commonly go out there to feed like the dogs, and sometimes I would take care of the horses and that sort of thing. So Mom would go out there, and like for example, she would maybe be carrying like some hay out to some of the horses. And she tells you that one day she had been walking along, and she was walking down the driveway to the barn. She said she just happened to look in the wood line, and she sees something that's the color of an orangutan. And she said what caught her attention about it was the color of it, being like kind of an autumn color. She said that what it caught her attention about it was the color, because the time of year this happened, I believe, would have been like in spring. And basically the warmer months when you wouldn't have any autumn-colored plants around. So she told me, like, I asked her a few nights ago because I didn't want to get anything with the story and I wanted to be as detailed as possible. So she told me upon seeing this, she took a few steps back and she started staring at this particular area. And she said it looked like something basically was in front of a tree and it was putting its back up against the tree like, oh, no, you see me. And she told me that the hair was like an orangutan color. She said like where like about the center of the torso was, she said it looked like you could kind of see skin and stuff like that. And of course, like my mom, like her mentality was much different. My mom basically kind of had an ignore mentality about sort of things, which is sometimes the best thing you can do and not interact with it. But that was one encounter she had, and that particular squatch, I found out much later what it was, is there's some that were basically staying about 5 or 6 miles away on like some land that's like on the complete opposite side of where they were. And there's a waterway back there, And what it is, these creatures do tend to follow waterways, just like legends say. But the story was that particular Squatch is, my mom only saw it once, but I never saw it. And I believe that what that thing was, it might have been like a rival male. And something like Squatches will actually do in nature that's never been witnessed is sometimes a male will go into like an established family, and what it will try to do is basically kill off the male, or basically challenge it. And then what it will do is actually kill the young, and then actually take the female. So the reason that creature probably never materialized again is probably because he's dead and in the ground, or he basically got his butt beat and he never came back again.
Wow.
Okay,
yeah.
So one of the next stories my mom had that's a really cool encounter is she told me that one day she'd been out there and she would feed the horses and that sort of thing. This is some of the early encounters that she would have. And, of course, she would see stuff in the tree line and that sort of thing. And, the thing about these creatures, they were very unpredictable. Like a lot of people I'm sure are probably wondering, like, well, why didn't you take a picture of this? Back then the only camera I had would have been a cell phone. If you could go back to what a cell phone looked like back then, the camera on them, it would have been like filming Bigfoot through a carrot. You know what I mean?
Right.
And but Mom basically told me what it is. We had this one barn that was basically made out of concrete blocks, and it was very close to like where the road was. And so there was like this narrow patch of just really old trees that were right behind it. She told me she was sitting there, and I believe she said she was actually sitting in the car, and she was getting ready to drive away. She said she looked over there, and she noticed there was this big black tree trunk. And she said, wow, that color's really off. She said, that's almost too black to be a tree or anything like that. So what it was is the big male we had living down there, something that he would actually do is he would actually almost test our intelligence. He would come out and like where you could plainly see him, and it's like he would do this to see if you would take note of it or almost acknowledge him in a way. It would be almost like they were kind of testing your intelligence to see how close they could actually get to you sometimes. But she said that basically what he would have been doing, he would have been standing there kind of like with his feet together. His head would have been kind of pointing down. And she said what was weird about it, she could say it was just teetering, in other words, just kind of rocking back and forth. And she said you could kind of see the hair blowing on it in the wind and that sort of thing. So that was the first time I believe she actually got to see that big male that we had.
Right. So they do the swaying thing like that to try to mimic maybe something blowing in the wind and look like shrubbery or a tree or something like that.
They commonly did that. Like there would be a lot of times like where I would go out, for example, and a lot of these times where they would come out and be right in front of you, they would be so unpredictable. I mean, you would have sometimes, like every once in a while they would give us a break. You might not see them for about 2 or 3 days. If we were lucky, we didn't get to see them for about 2 or 3 weeks. But generally they would always come and stand in the same exact places in the wood line. And, basically the one I called Goliath was a big male. He would stand kind of like in some shrubs and like some fir trees and that sort of thing. But, people think that these creatures are very, very dumb, aloof apes and don't realize that they have a lot of movements they can actually do. They'll go and lay on their stomach, for example. They'll go and they'll actually sit down and watch you. And sometimes they'll watch you from very tall trees. And a lot of times when people go out and they're looking for them, they're looking for something standing, but they don't realize that these creatures will watch you from a tree, and they'll actually lay on their stomach and watch you from the woods, and you can't see where they're at other than like kind of sensing that they're there. Okay, so like one of the days that I was actually out there, I looked, and then there was the big black one, and he was basically like almost sitting there like the thinking man, minus having like his hand against his chin, and he was sitting out there watching me. And I used to sit there and see this and think, man, why can't these scientists come out here and do this? But upon him doing that, I realized in the long run, all he was doing is it seemed to be like I said, he was kind of testing our intelligence to see if like he would if we would acknowledge to see if he was actually there, And it's something I ended up doing is I constantly underestimated these creatures in terms of how close they would actually get to you. And you'll be surprised how close they can be standing just a mere 15, 20 feet away from you in some trees. And they're very smart about hiding and concealing. They know how to use shadow and lighting to their benefit in terms of like, covering themselves. And So like a lot of times, like when I would see him in the tree line and stuff like that, after a while you could actually train your eye to kind of look for something just very, very dark in the tree line. But like I guess where I kind of got lucky with him is he would always kind of stand in the same few places, so I always know where he was standing. So the female, I didn't really have a lot of full-on physical encounters with her. But, my mom mentioned to you one day when the horse was actually staring at the wood line, and the male horse, the female very seldomly would come out like during like the very early day. But there was this one particular day we had a male Arabian on the property, and so he was staring at the tree line, and he just stares at it for like 30 minutes, doesn't move, doesn't blink, has his nostrils just flaring, and he's just kind of, kind of riled up. And then what it is he would actually be staring at that female in the tree line. So I knew to look in that particular vicinity whenever, she would be standing out there. And something she would commonly do is she would generally, like, she would go and stand, like, during the wintertime and, like, some of the fall months, she would actually go and stand around by, like, autumn-colored brush and trees and stuff like that. So she would actually blend in. So, like, that was another dead giveaway on how to find her is you would go out and spot her. So one day I went out there and I could actually see her, but I couldn't physically full on see her because she was up in some trees and that sort of thing. But I could actually see her body. And after I acknowledged her presence and just kind of stared at that spot for a little while, she actually never went and stood in that spot again. So something she would actually do was go to the very back of the property where, like, we had a fence line and there was another wood line back there. So she would actually go and stay in the background. So something I learned about these creatures is a lot of times you'll have one that's standing very close to you and it's within your visual range, and then there's generally another one that'll be watching you from the background and that's out of your visual range. And that's sort of how they kind of work in terms of that.
Wow. That's very interesting. That's one of the reasons they're really hard to catch on film too, because they're so good at blending and using light and shadow and color of things that are around. You hear about that a lot. A lot of the things that you said about them being in the trees or them laying on their belly or squatting down to look like they're a stump or something, or all that kind of stuff. That all fits with the things that you hear, and you
Well, another
certainly.
thing people don't know is they commonly use the wind as like something, like for example, like a lot of times if I wanted to go out there and kind of get an idea where they were, a lot of times they'll stand in the wind where the wind is actually hitting them. So in other words, not to carry their scent and anything like that. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll use the wind to their advantage as well. And I guess they think maybe that we can smell them or sense them like that, But a lot of times they'll be standing in the wind, where in other words the wind is hitting them and the wind is not blowing away from them and blowing their scent towards you. So that's something else they commonly do is they'll actually use the wind.
Wow, that's amazing. You said something about one time giving an orange to them, and you said something about not encouraging anyone to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, well, when a lot of that stuff was going on, really the only thing that I'm really guilty of is actually going out and wanting to find the footprint. When these creatures would come up and flop around my house and stuff like that, I would actually go and look around the house and see if I couldn't find any kind of tracks or anything like that. And the grass basically grew all the way to where the house was. So, I mean, you could go out there and you would see prints in terms of, like, where the grass would be mashed down and where they would step in clovers and stuff like that, but you just didn't get anything that looked like a footprint, And a lot of times when they go and they'll step in grass and stuff like that, you really can't go by it because when they step in grass, the footprint actually expands, and so it's actually bigger than it really is.
Right.
So at the minimum, I was just trying to get like a footprint, something that had dermal ridges and that sort of thing. And so I didn't know any more about these creatures than anybody else did. So when we first started going out there, I decided, okay, I want to get a footprint. So we had this pond that was close to the tree line where the big male would go and stand. And so I had the idea, okay, maybe I should go and put some fruit out. And of course, I know better than to feed something wild, but a lot of people need to understand that these creatures were coming up and nabbing the sweet feed. You know what I mean? So we were damned if we do, and you're damned if you don't, like Bart Simpson says. I mean, they were already taking food off the property from the horses. So it really didn't matter so much that I was going and putting out something every few weeks or doing this once in a while, because they were already taking the horses' squeeze feed.
Right.
So I would actually go and put like fruit and stuff around like the edge of the ponds, like where there would be soft soil, in hopes that they would go out there and step on it. And these things are so smart that one thing they never do here is they will never walk on soft ground. They will never leave any kind of impression or a track like that. So I didn't have any luck. So I got to where, like, every few weeks, what I would do is I would go and I would get an orange and I would slice it up, halfway down the center. And I would go and put, like, just sugar, just regular everyday sugar inside of the orange. And some of the first 3 times that I would actually go and leave fruit down there, they wouldn't take it. They would not touch it. They would absolutely leave that fruit there for days. It would sit there for days on end. And I would actually just go down there and pick it up. And so what ends up happening, it was later in the afternoon, and I guess it's going on about dusk, and it was probably, I remember it was like during a warmer month. But my mom called me from my house. She said, "Would you mind going out and feed the horses?" So I looked out. I said, "I really don't want to go down there at sunset." I said, "You know what happens at sunset down around there?" And she's like, "Well, the dogs haven't been out today." And I mean, like, I got kind of frustrated because I'd been sitting around the house all day not doing anything. And I wish that she would have called me much earlier in the day, because I would have been perfectly fine. I didn't mind helping her at all. So what ends up happening is I decided I'm going to take an orange and put it down there in a tree line. So I got the orange ready. I drove out to the property. And something else that I would commonly do, like if I knew like mom didn't feed the horses or she wasn't going to be around the next day to feed the horses, we had a bin that we would actually keep the sweet feed in. So something I would actually do is I would actually go and, like, if you were to actually see what they would do to the sweet feed, they would pop the top off of it. They would toss it on the ground, and you would see like this big scoop swipe in the center of like the sweet feed. Now, if it had been like some kind of critter such as a raccoon doing it, you'd be surprised that you would never see any sweet feed laying around on the ground. It was never messy. In other words, they must have been eating like right over the bin. And so I always had to go out there and I always had to put the top on. But something I learned to do to know if they'd been around or not is I would actually go and just level out the top of the sweet feed, to where you had like an even surface. So when I would go and look at the top of the sweet feed, you would see this big swipe in the center of it, So like I would know they had been out there if there was a big swipe in it. But if the top of the sweet feed was still level, I would know they'd not been out there by that day, if that makes sense. Okay,
Yeah.
so I go out there and I check the top of the sweet feed. I noticed that it hadn't been touched that day, and a lot of times it's so easy to get wrapped up in what you're doing. You don't think about looking over your shoulder, and you're focused on what you're doing. And that was the thing that probably annoyed me the most, is that you always kind of had to constantly keep your guard up. So basically what it was, I decided that I was going to go and put an orange out at the tree line. So what it is, I would walk from the barn over to like around the side of one of these ponds where like the tree line was, where these creatures were standing. So upon doing this, a lot of times I was doing it much earlier in the day. So I had my guard down, not paying attention to what I'm doing. So when you're getting ready to walk to the spot where I would place the food at, you can't see anything, like in terms of what's on the other side of you, because there's all these bushes and just, foliage and trees and stuff like that. And so I couldn't really sense anything. Nothing felt off. So I go and I actually go and I walk around like the edge of the pond. I'm about center ways in it. I go and I actually put like the orange down, like where the grass would end. There would be dirt there, in hopes of getting a footprint. So I put the orange down. All of a sudden, I look over to my left and I notice there's something huge and black. I look up and about 15 feet away from me is that big male. And man, he's sitting there, and he's just staring at me. He just has this completely blank expression. And I had no idea how big this, I almost said a very bad word. I had no big idea. No idea how big this effort was until I actually got 15 feet away from him. And he was much taller than I thought. I mean, he was just standing there. And a lot of times, like the way they stand and stuff is like the knees are bent. They look almost kind of hunched. The arms are very long. And so he was just standing there just looking at me. And I just like immediately looked him in the face. And then like I immediately thought to myself, oh God, don't look him in the eyes. So I immediately looked at his chin and started looking at his chest region. And I don't know, this might sound silly, but I started showing him my hands. It's, hey, I don't have anything. I'm not armed. I don't have anything on me. So I just kind of started slowly backing up. And then what it is I started running towards like the open part of the field. When I got probably about halfway away from them, man, I went and I ran. I jumped over the damn fence. I got in the car. I went home and I almost wanted to puke. I ended up calling my mom on the phone. I said, I'm not going down there anymore after this. And she thought I was just being a jackass, and we just didn't want to go out there and feed her. And I didn't tell her what happened at first. But it turned out where that male was actually standing was the same exact spot where she saw that orangutan color one sometime before.
Wow.
And so I got that close to that big dude, and if he wanted to have killed me that day, he could have, and he absolutely didn't. I mean, I think they understood that we were afraid of him. You know, if that makes sense. I think they felt like maybe we didn't mean them any harm. They didn't perceive us as a threat. So I think for that particular reason is why they just really, you know, kind of like, how do you say, calm down over time, because we weren't going out of our way to engage. And like I say, I'm guilty of going out there and trying to get a track and that sort of thing, but I wasn't doing anything that you would call engaging. In other words, I wasn't trying to like interact with them where I could have made a mistake and sent some kind of wrong signal to them.
Right. So how tall do you think that the big alpha male was?
I went out there one day with a tape measure, and I actually had to climb up a tree that was close to where he was. And when I actually measured it from like where I thought about where the top of his head was, you know, a lot of people probably think I'm embellishing. He would have been about 10'2". And I cannot tell you how small I actually felt. I mean, go look at an 8-foot ceiling, then look up at something 10 feet tall. And in terms of how big he was, man, I mean, the center of his body was very lean. The shoulders looked like they were almost about 5.5 to 6 feet wide, and the top of his arms were just completely sculpted along with his chest. I mean, he looked like he'd been lifting weights or climbing trees his entire life. I mean, he had like these big bodybuilder-looking legs, and I mean, he had black hair. And I guess a really good description of him, you know, like the hair was probably about the same length all over some portions of the body, but like where the top of his body was, it looked like almost like he would have had a mane in the way the hair was a little bit longer around the very top of the arms going around the chest area. He had like a very dark gray face. His nose, you know, like people talk about having Neanderthal-looking features, but the nose almost reminded me of like a Caucasian European type nose, and the way the bridge is, and like how it's just a wide kind of a European kind of a looking nose and stuff like that. The mouth is very wide, and of course he had like these kind of just black-looking eyeballs and stuff, and he just sat there with this blank expression. And it just completely freaked me out. And after that, I did not want to go out there anymore.
Did his face have hair mostly over the whole face, or was the face kind of bare?
Like, I guess the way it looks like he has, like where the cheekbones and that sort of thing are, he would have had like hair on the face growing up into that, to where kind of like the lines of like they're out right outside the mouth would be. So like in terms of the skin, you could actually see on the face. You could actually see probably like, you know, like just a little bit under the chin. You can see like around like about the center of the face and stuff like that. The cheeks are just very, very broad and just very exaggerated and just very rounded. Then like where the top, where like say like where our brows would be, there was almost kind of like a widow's point, and then kind of going over like the brow region and stuff. But I mean, you could kind of, he didn't absolutely have hair growing all over the face, and then like his hair wasn't long to where you could kind of say it was like a beard or anything like that, but most definitely he had hair like on the bottom of his chin and that sort of thing.
So it's kind of easily distinguishable as a male, because they seem to, I guess, kind of have a little bit of features of what a male, like a beard and things like that.
Yeah, and then like when you look at them in the face, you know, some of them tend to look a lot more monkey looking, but it's almost like you can see age in their face, just like you can with a human being. And I mean, like if I had to guess, like in terms of a human age, in terms of what he looked like, I'd say that he probably would have been like in his mid-40s or something like that, because you could see expression lines and just sort of wrinkles and stuff like that, you know?
Right. Wow, that's very
I mean,
interesting.
a lot of the creatures that I've seen, they very much, they have a lot of similarities. But then, like, sometimes the heads are completely different. The noses have been different and that sort of thing. But like, a lot of them tend to look very much alike in terms of, I guess, in terms of, like, the type of species they are, you know, which are like these patty-type creatures. And we do have, like, other creatures around here that tend to look a lot more primates. like around the lake area that I was telling you about, commonly the ones that people see there, they don't look as humanoid as the ones that I've seen, and people describe them as like I've said, like looking like big monkeys and stuff like that, and they tend to look a lot more primate-like looking in the face. And, you know, I mentioned, like, some of my friends before, you know, that knew about these creatures. And then, like, they would tell me, you know, basically, like, it's been some time ago, I actually sat down with that friend, and I went over some pictures. And I said, okay, did it look like this? Did it look like this? And I would show her, like, the Patterson creature. I would show her, like, some photographs of these other kind of type A species. And then I would start showing her, like, some of these pictures of, like, the skunk apes and stuff like that. They tend to look a little bit more orangutan-ish.
Right.
And she goes, no, it looked more like this. And I'm like, are you sure? Because, you know, like, again, I'm not an expert. I don't proclaim to be. And so, like, early on, I thought a lot of these creatures always looked alike. You know what I mean? I thought they all looked like Patty, if that makes sense.
Right, right. Yeah. There seems to be several different types throughout, you know, like just like people, you know.
One of the last encounter stories I heard would probably been this past year. There was a gentleman that lived out close to where, like, one of the guys I was telling you about, that came upon, like, the deer carcass that was basically freshly skinned. And he's, you know, like, he talked about seeing strange lights in the sky. There was a gentleman I met, and what it was is one day he actually had turned around in my driveway. So I go out, you know, I had to kind of see what people were doing outside every once in a while. So the guy, he's very nice. He introduced himself, and he tells me where he lived. So he lived within just, like, say about maybe 10 or 15 miles away from where this particular hunter had this experience. So I asked him, I said, do you ever see anything big and hairy out there? He goes, you talking about Bigfoot? And what I did is I tend to throw myself under the bus first, and I'll tell people what happened to me. I'll tell people about some of my experiences, and then they tend to open up. So the guy tells me that one day he was on some of his property, and he'd gone out. He just basically went out there with some preteen kids that worked with that were kids of people that he worked with. So he tells me they basically had came to this spot where they had followed a creek for probably about a half a mile or so. And he said there was this really big tree that had fallen across the creek from one side to the other. So the kids, what it was is they wanted to go and cross the creek, and they wanted to go back there and just mess around or whatever. And so he said, like, when he first got to this area, he said for some reason he just didn't want to go through it. He said it was just some very thick brush. He said there was a lot of stickers and that sort of thing. So he said they went back there, and they decided they were going to go, and they were going to come back to his house. So he says on the way out, as they got ready to cross the log, there was a creature that was just basically sitting down and had like a big stick in his hands. It was just sitting there and said it wasn't looking at them. In other words, it kept aside to him, and I guess it would have been kind of watching them out of the corner of its eye. So immediately I started asking him, I said, what did the thing look like? He started telling me that it was like kind of an auburn brown kind of color. He said the hair on the head was actually much, much longer, but he also described it as looking more primate than like the patty type Sasquatch.
Wow. That's interesting.
And, you know, like, I guess, like, the punchline of most of these stories is everybody always runs, you know, like, if the Squatches at, like, my aunt's property would have had a name for me, it would have been the Runner. I ran so many times. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, seems like we got cut off again. I think that was about the end, anyway. And I do want to say thank you to Q, and we'll have him back on again sometime because he's got all kinds of stories. But anyway, I have a one of my paintings that I had done a while back for the Hollow Earth Darrow stuff. I had printed here a little while back, and it's on a very high quality paper where the color is really, really brilliant. If you look at it in person, it's really brilliant, and you know, it's fairly decent size. And what I was going to do, I've been talking about making some of these posters. I'm going to offer this one to sell to anyone who would want this type thing. You may only like the Bigfoot Dogman stuff, and I will print some of those out this month. But anyway, anyone who would like this, as soon as it sells, I will put a little note in the annotations up that it's sold. But you all can email me at brentonsawin@gmail.com and tell me what you want to give for it, and I'll use that towards helping me with the channel here. But this is pretty cool. I thought it was pretty neat, and it turned out really nice too. It's the classic of the Darrow drawings. The background I made up, and I kind of made it up, for the most part. But the Darrow itself is a kind of a classic pose from back in the 50s of someone that drew pictures for the Shaver Mysteries and what have you. And then this month, toward the end of the month, I will have some of the Dogman and Bigfoot stuff printed out, and I'll try to get them printed in quantity so they're not so expensive, because that I think cost something around $14 to get printed, 13 or 14, something like that. So it's really nice, and so you would have to spread it out and set some heavy stuff on it to make it straighten out, or glue it to a piece of cardboard or something like that. And I was thinking about getting some clear type folders where you could slide them in the folders, and I was wanting it to be masked out to where it looks like an iPhone, and I will sign it for whoever purchases it, and put thank you to whoever wants it, and Brenton Sawin Mysteries to search, and I'll put number 1 like it's the first one that's ever been sold. But anyway, thank you to Q for coming on. God bless you, and I appreciate everyone watching to this point, and I hope you enjoyed that. Very interesting stuff. Q certainly had a lot of encounters on the property when they had the horse farm there, and they lived in that particular area when he was younger, and he knows quite a bit about the Bigfoot Catamount subject. Interesting, the names that people called them before Bigfoot was labeled Bigfoot, from the prints and stuff. So they've been around for a long time. They were just called different things, from boogers to catamounts to haints to even chicken man, all kinds of different things. But thank you very much. Anyone who wants to contribute to this channel also, you can buy this poster, make an offer, what have you. Let a couple people offer on it, or if anyone wants it. And but if you want to help contribute to this channel too, that you can go to my PayPal, which is brentonsawin@gmail.com. And you can get to my PayPal, and at the bottom of the email you have the attachment stuff. If you compose the email, there's like the paper clip, and there's a $sign on there if you're in the United States. You can click on that, and I think you can do PayPal that way. And then also you can go to Facebook Mysteries to search, and you can get to that from the About section on my channel, or on a computer. You can click the little Facebook button, and I have a donate button there. And until next time, thank you very much. God bless you, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye-bye.